Right, thanks to Tom for that interview. The full interview is available on our website, I believe, so the conference website. So you better see that. There's 13 minutes of this, so there's a lot to listen to there in terms of gaining an understanding of natural capital and how we could use that to secure the investments that we need in our green infrastructure in the Tees Valley. Right, so we're moving into the even more interactive phase now, and we're gonna move over to Rachel, our partnership manager, with the panel for nature. So I'll hand over to Rachel, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hi, it's great to be here. I hope you're really enjoying the conference. We've been really excited about this. So as Tim said, I'm Rachel Murter, and I'm the manager of the Tees Valley Nature Partnership. So for the last bit of the conference today, we've got an expert panel that have been drawn from our partnership organisations. And they reflect the three themes that we work through. So natural assets, natural growth, and natural health and well-being. So we've chosen three of our organisations to cover each one of those, and three experts within those organisations to talk to you today. So whilst they're presenting, you'll be able to put your questions to the panel, and you can put those questions all the way through the presentations, and I'll be reading them. And then at the end of the three presentations, I'll be putting those questions to the panel, and we'll have a good discussion. Any question that you submit, we will endeavour to answer. If we can't do it today, we will do it over time and publish it on our website. And we're really, really keen to know what your questions are. What do you want to know about nature within the Tees Valley? So it's really important that you do submit your questions. So first of all, we have Mike Leakey, and who's covering the ecology of the Tees area, and Mike's speaking to us from INCA, the Industry and Nature Conservation Association, but he'll tell you more. So over to you now, Mike.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Leakey. I've worked on Teesside for Natural England and its predecessor bodies for 25 years. Since 2016, I've been with INCA, the Industry Nature Conservation Association, which is a third sector, not-for-profit body that promotes nature conservation and sustainable development within Teesside's industrial sector, working with statutory agencies, local authorities, and so on. And just recently, INCA has celebrated its 30th anniversary, so we have some history in the area. This morning, I'm going to give you a brisk tour through the geography, landscapes, habitats, and species of the Tees Valley. In other words, our natural assets. Next slide. This shows the whole of the River Tees catchment, which extends from the slopes of Crossfell, far in the high Pennines on the left-hand side of the map there, down to the sea at Tees mouth. The River Tees is approximately 70 miles long. I believe it's the 28th longest river in England, and it has significant, tributaries. The River Skerne, visible there, and the River Leven. There are two major tributaries, though neither can really qualify as a significant river. But that defines our area. Today, we're going to very much focus on the LNP, the Local Nature Partnership area, which is essentially the eastern half of that map that you can see there, along with East Cleveland, which lies in the Esk catchment, in the extreme east of that map there. Next slide, please. This slide shows the current land use of the Tees Valley, and you can see that it's overwhelmingly agricultural. So over half the land area is occupied by agriculture, over a quarter is urban in nature, and the remaining less than a quarter comprises woodland, water, semi-natural grasslands and other, and most of the other will be taken up by either upland or lowland heath on the North York Moors fringe. Next slide, please. This slide shows the hierarchy of protected areas. At the top, we have a Ramsar site, a wetland of international importance, Teesmouth and Cleveland coast. We also have special protection areas, special areas of conservation, one of them, Teesmouth National Nature Reserve, and 13 different sites of special scientific interest. Below that, we have 22 local nature reserves, 300 local wildlife and geological sites, and 14 Tees Valley Wildlife Trust reserves. Next slide, please. The partnership has identified 5 landscape areas, each with its own characteristics. You can see on the main map there, East Cleveland, Teesmouth, Middlesbrough Beck Valleys, Central Farmland, and the River Tees corridor running from east to west. The map also shows some nature opportunity areas which overlie these classifications. And these are the areas where it has been identified that the most valuable productive interventions for nature could be made. Next slide, please. Our coast is not particularly long, but it is extremely varied, and it varies from the high cliffs, Hunt Cliff on the top left-hand side of your screen, down to the flats and marshes of Teesmouth, shown on the top right-hand side of the screen, with the grazing marshes and wetlands there. And at the bottom right, we also have sand flats and sand dunes associated with Teesmouth itself. The bottom left-hand slide shows some wonderful maritime grassland on the slopes of the cliffs at Hummersea in East Cleveland. Our woodland habitats, next slide, are not particularly extensive in the Tees Valley. I think that Cleveland historically has one of the lowest areas, percentage cover of woodland in England. But nevertheless, we do have some really good ancient woodlands, most of them associated with the steep-sided gills in East Cleveland, and most of these photographs here show those habitats. And the bottom right, you can see some polluted mine water turning the watercourse a bright orange. But fortunately, through the interventions of the Environment Agency, the situation has been improved greatly, and many of our streams and rivers in East Cleveland now run clear, as the centre bottom photograph would show. Next slide, please. Freshwater habitats are reasonably varied. Many of them are associated with aggregate extraction, sand and gravel, as at Bowesfield in the top left here, Drinkfield Marsh in Darlington, bottom right. The other 2 slides show Cotham Marsh near Redcar, which has some good reed beds and also an artificial sand martin colony, which is the structure you can see on the bottom left-hand slide. Next slide, please. Given that 28% of our land area in the Tees Valley is classified as urban habitats are of great importance, and obviously that's where the majority of our population live. So if we're going to connect people with their natural environment, we need to do it first and foremost in urban habitats, and that's going on, as you can see on the top left-hand side of the screen at Flats Lane. South Park in Darlington is the other main picture on the top there. But these habitats are very important in their own right, and also, as I said, to connect people with nature. Next slide, please. Brownfield habitats. Now, the top left-hand slide there might look to be a bit of a desert devoid of wildlife, but in fact, it's one of the crown jewels of our area. This is formerly estuarine land, which was reclaimed, much of it in the 1970s, although the history of reclamation goes back 200 years before that. Reclaimed with blast furnace slag and marine dredgings. And this gives rise to a very sparse vegetation cover, but one that is highly diverse and features lots of plants, which in the wider agricultural landscape are actually very scarce. It's a habitat that hasn't received traditionally a great deal of recognition from the statutory conservation agencies, but increasingly we're seeing the value of it. And those habitats also exist further upriver, as at Mays Park on the bottom left. The other slide shows some habitat creation at the Suez works at Haverton Hill, which is maturing nicely. Next slide, please. Yeah, moving on to birds. Clearly, we have a special protection area for birds based around Teesmouth. Little Tern, which is the bird in the top left-hand corner, has one of its most important colonies, breeding colonies, in the whole of northern England. And that's occupied various sites over the last 30 or 40 years. Currently, the majority of birds are nesting at Seacombe Carew. The bottom left, you can see some oyster catchers roosting on a slag bank at North Gare. And that's there to illustrate the fact that we have an assemblage of more than 20,000 wintering water birds on the Tees estuary, and that's of international importance. The other slide shows some young peregrines, not that far from fledging, and we have a good population of urban peregrines on Teesside as well, many of them nesting on industrial structures, as you can see here. Next slide, please. Our mammals are surprisingly varied for such a small county, if you like, or such a small area. Bats, roe deer, otter, brown hare, harbour seal, water vole and harbour porpoise all find a home in the Tees Valley and the waters around it. I should probably pick out harbour seals because our population of 100 to 130 harbour seals is the only breeding colony of this species between Lincolnshire and the Scottish border, so it's quite important. Our water voles perhaps also deserve a mention. In the wider countryside, they are extremely scarce, but we have some populations in the Teesmouth area and also in the Middlesbrough Beck valleys. Next slide, please. Reptiles and amphibians would include common lizard, grey-crested newt at the top. The fish are brook lamprey, brown trout and salmon, and the invertebrates in the centre are grayling butterfly, dingy skipper butterfly, and broad-bodied chaser dragonfly. Those two butterflies, incidentally, are very much associated with the brownfield habitats that we saw on an earlier slide, and they have some really important flourishing populations on those grasslands. Next slide, please. Plants vary from the very small purple milk vetch on the top left-hand side to the very large black poplar on the top right-hand side. Purple milk vetch, it loves the coastal dunes, some of the herb-rich coastal dunes of Teesside. Black poplar is close to the northern limit of its UK distribution. But a wide variety of plants and botanical habitats exist in the Tees Valley. This final slide shows a spatial representation of some important habitats. First of all, blue space, which is essentially water habitats. In the centre, green space, areas of urban green space. And on the right-hand side, the open mosaic habitats associated with the brownfield land, which I've mentioned. And the idea here is to represent the current state of play in relation to what Professor Sir John Lawton, the principles he's laid out. What we need are larger areas of key habitats. We need them to be better managed, and we need them to be more joined up. So this slide attempts to show the connectivity and relative importance and size of these habitats, with the darker colours, the magentas and the purples, indicating a greater concentration of those habitats and greater extent of those habitats. And for example, you can see the open mosaic habitats are very much concentrated in the Teesmouth area and the urban area of Teesside. So we need to move to a systems approach now with natural capital accounting, biodiversity opportunity areas, and nature recovery networks. Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed that presentation there. So thank you very much, Mike. So we're going to move on swiftly to the next presentation, and this is in our natural growth theme. And we've got Eddie Halstead from the Environment Agency, who's the Tees Programme Manager. So I'm going to hand over to Eddie, and he's going to take it from here. Don't forget to keep your questions coming.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Mike. And good morning, all. Or just afternoon, as it is now. I hope you're all keeping well. I'm sat at home with 2 homeschoolers in the background, so hopefully they don't disturb our enjoyment of this presentation too much. This is, I guess, very much a local nature conference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through, I guess, a bit of the national context, but how it relates to the Tees Valley, and then talk about how the Tees Valley is also influencing that national context as well. So if you could put up the slide 3, please. So I work for the Environment Agency. So the Environment Agency, what do we do? We are a national government regulator. There are about 10,000 of us nationally, about 400 in the northeast area, which covers the Tees Valley. And we work to help people and wildlife adapt to climate change and reduce its impacts. An important issue for the Tees Valley. We are particularly focused on water as an organisation, but we all rely on water, so that sees us get involved in a huge range of activities. And it's also important to say we are a large agency of government, but we aren't alone. There are a number of us working around us, so Natural England, the Marine Management Organisation, plus many other agencies, and we all work for DEFRA, which of course is part of government. Next slide, please. It's important to flag as well that we are a national organisation, but we do work locally. So we're very keen to support local priorities, to put local people and wildlife first. And we try to prioritise activity. And I think one of the reasons why the Tees Valley is so important to us is because there are so many challenges, but also so many opportunities, which is why we're so keen to work in this area. The next slide, please. So I guess this is a national bit. So this seems a long time ago now, but notwithstanding all the upheaval our country's gone through over the last 2 or 3 years, there does remain a suite of national strategies that set the policy context for that sustainable growth, for that natural growth. So there was an industrial strategy in 2017, and many of the strands of that continue to run through the government's policy today. But also that brought a clean growth strategy about the importance of having a low carbon economy. And alongside that, which is probably closest to the heart of a lot of the attendees today, is the 25-year plan for the environment. And I think it's worth flagging as well, this isn't the Environment Agency's plan, this isn't DEFRA's plan, this is the government's plan launched by the Prime Minister. And it sets a very ambitious target, for the first time in a long, long time, to say that we will improve the environment within a generation and leave it in a better state than we found it. So how do we do that? Well, very, very briefly, it sets, I guess, one key concept, which is the concept of biodiversity net gain. So that net gain in the quality of habitats. And it sets a rough target of 10% for that. And it places that ask on developers to do that when they are developing new developments. And it has an aspiration to move that from biodiversity net gain to wider environmental net gain over the course of the plan. So it proposes to measure that using natural capital, a term you might have heard a few times today, and that includes not just habitat, but what that habitat can do for air quality, for example, for noise, for temperature regulation, for carbon sequestration. I could go on. So there are 2 concepts there about biodiversity net gain and also natural capital, which I'll return to later. And I think it's important to flag that, again, notwithstanding the current challenges we have, the government are committed to get the Environment Bill, which is the bill that is delivering much of the legislation for the 25-year plan, through Parliament before the summer. So let's hope that does happen. Next slide, please. So I guess I mentioned we prioritise as an organisation. Well, why is the Tees Valley important to us as an Environment Agency? Well, I think it's a place where water is a very important part of its history and also its current identity. It's a place with a legacy of industrialisation and pollution and a loss of natural features for our rivers. And we're working to tackle that pollution through partners such as, water companies, through our regulation role, but also through our own investment. So you've seen things like river restoration within Darlington on the Skern, now happening at Brightwater, just north of Darlington, also tackling mine water pollution in East Cleveland, for example. It's also an area which is incredibly important, or climate change is an incredibly important issue. I guess both the risks, it is a tidal estuary, and sea level rise could see people and habitats at increasing risk of climate change over the next few years. It's a place of industrial change, as I mentioned. That industrial change has left a legacy of pollution in certain places, but also social deprivation. People want jobs, notwithstanding the current pandemic. They wanted them beforehand, and as a consequence, the area has some big growth ambitions. And I think it's really exciting that a lot of those growth ambitions are in the low carbon economy and will help mitigate climate change. So you've got things like wind farms, you've got carbon capture and storage, hydrogen economy. So these are very much the good guys, but still they create pressures. Many of them are happening in and around our river and marine environments, and that creates pressure for us. So next slide, please. So I mentioned some concepts before, biodiversity net gain and natural capital. So if I just come back to biodiversity net gain. For those who aren't aware, the planning system, as it currently is, has a principle of no net loss. And I think there was dissatisfaction with how that works for a range of parties. I think national, but particularly in the Tees Valley, it's very much reactive. Mechanisms for assessing no net loss aren't transparent. There's no real incentivization for preemptive enhancement of biodiversity and of habitats. So here in the Tees Valley, this was recognised about 4 or 5 years ago now, and we've been proud to be part of the Tees Estuary Partnership. So the Tees Estuary Partnership are driving forward the idea of a habitat bank, a bespoke habitat bank for the eastern end of the Tees Valley, centred around the estuary. And the important thing there is to try and get that environmental uplift alongside that job uplift. It's a coalition of the willing. We've all been working very much outside our comfort zones. We are, as I say, looking to make that place a great place for nature and for investment. And I think what's great about that group is there's a range of public, private, third sector partners, so names like Inca, Mike's organisation, the local authorities, a number of the landowners and businesses there, a number of the nature charities. And I think the benefits that that's had locally is that we've had a regulators MOU, which has given us an opportunity to explain more clearly to developers what can happen to support activity in the estuary. But also it's brought us a clear understanding of the huge range of opportunity sites throughout the estuary to improve habitat. And it's brought a number of landowners who weren't previously in those conversations to that conversation. So beyond the usual suspects as well. So that's been great. And I guess that's the local benefits, but nationally, a lot of the thinking we've been doing has been feeding into the mechanisms and the assessment metrics of how biodiversity net gain will work. And it's fed into the thinking of the Environment Bill team. So as I said, the Environment Bill is going through, that's codified much more clearly now, I think, the different roles about who will deliver now biodiversity net gain. So it's now clearer the roles of the local planning authorities, for example, the roles of organisations like the Nature Partnership around perhaps combined authorities. And I think that's what's enabled the Environment Agency to focus much more on developing that pipeline of really high quality, investable projects that will deliver biodiversity net gain, that could potentially see others investing in those. And the big picture you can see here is an example of where we've got a recently completed scheme as part of the Port Clarence and Greetham South flood risk protection projects. But they were very much green infrastructure projects with working with nature at the heart. So we stepped back the defences there. We generated about £500 million of conventional economic benefits, but protected 350 homes and 32 businesses. But I think the important thing there was 48 hectares of habitat created. And I guess that's under the conventional process. And I mentioned natural capital, I mentioned biodiversity net gain before, but moving on to natural capital, I think for those in the environment sector, and I think if people are honest with themselves, those outside the environment sector, have always known that nature does good stuff for us. But I think the challenge has been putting the evidence around that, and then being able to put the economic value around that. So what natural capital isn't about doing is putting a pound sign on habitat. The role of habitat to be habitat for nature, for species, is an absolute given. We're not changing that, and that's essential. But actually, beyond that core job, what else can it do for benefits such as carbon sequestration, recreation activity, air quality, all those things that we're describing as natural capital? So I refer again to the big picture here. So this is an example of what we were doing over the last 4 or 5 years, and we have an ambitious plan to do much more of this. So a project, or 3 further projects potentially, to do further green infrastructure-led flood risk schemes, plus potentially further environmental projects, where we will, again, generate potentially 60 hectares of habitat as part of those schemes. And I think why natural capital is important there is because it's potentially 60 hectares of salt marsh. That salt marsh is an essential habitat, but we do have figures that show that salt marsh is as important, if possibly not more important, than woodland for sequestering carbon. So how can we start to maybe use that evidence to then buy in or sell that product to customers who may need to sequester their carbon? So just a bit of context that we think the Tees Valley Combined Authority area as a whole, the Nature Partnership area, the natural environment sequesters about 84,000 tonnes of CO2 at the moment. How can we add to that? How can we add to that asset? So to put that into context, the Carbon Capture and Storage project, the Net Zero Teesside project, is expected to sequester 6 million tonnes per annum. So that's very much a technical fix. The natural solution at the moment is providing about 1% of that, but it's also providing a huge range of other benefits. And how can we also develop that alongside the technical fixes? That's something really exciting to try and develop. But then also, how could we, as well as providing, for example, these environmental projects to maybe developers who have net gain commitments that they need to find a solution to, how could we sequester carbon? How could we start to realise some of the health, amenity, recreation benefits that nature's providing? How can we demonstrate those? But then also some of the challenges around how can we then find people who are willing and able to buy into those products? I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Eddie. Wow, a lot of food for thought there. Very densely packed with information. We've had some really great questions coming through. Please do keep sending your questions through during the last presentation. And we just had a little time check here, and we're conscious that because a little slightly delays getting going, that we're running over a bit. But I think the panel questions will be really, really interesting. So it may mean that we're going to overrun slightly because the conference is due to finish at 1. But it won't be any more than 10 minutes overrun. But we thought just edging it a little bit to answer some of your questions would be great. So I hope you're okay with that. So thank you, Eddie. We're going to move on to Sue now. So Sue works for the Tees Valley Wildlife Trust, and we've asked her to talk in our natural health and well-being section, and particularly around people and nature, because that's specifically where her expertise lies. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Sue.
Hello there. I'm just checking that my screen is working and that people can see it. That's excellent. Well, you'll be pleased to know that I have my egg timer here, so to use as an alarm, and I'm going to set it now. So excited to be here. I work for Tees Valley Wildlife Trust, but I'm joining you from my dining room table. And I've been asked to speak about the Tees Valley Wild Green Places project, which finished in April. And so I'm going to spend about 5 minutes focusing about that, and then a little bit on the legacy of the project. Let me see. Right, and let's see if whether it's scrolling. Can people see the next picture? So it's a place to talk about this project at the Nature Partnership Conference, because it was the original idea for the project did come about through the Nature Partnership. It was one of its first initiatives, and it was to address the people and nature element of the work. So it's a project that was delivered by the Wildlife Trust, but with 5 local authorities acting as key partners, with Eric, who you've heard from this morning, our Records Centre involved, 4 further and higher education establishments, and at the beginning 20 friends and community groups, but along the way we picked up many more organisations, groups and individuals. So it was quite a complex project, but I still think now, looking back, that perhaps the hardest bit was writing the application to the lottery. We did an awful lot of research, discussion with our partners, developing the activity plan, but that actually paid a lot of dividends, because what it meant is that we had a very clear direction through the project. But 5 years, things do change as you go along, and we had to be really, really flexible to accommodate these changes. So as you can see, I had great fun putting these pictures together, because these are all some of the really wonderful people that I work with. I've got so many great memories from the pictures, and often when a project ends and you've filled in your last lottery form, you think, whew, that's relief. But to be honest, I think I did shed a few tears at the end of the project. So I haven't got time to go through all the outputs and the outcomes of the project. So what I want to focus on is about what the core mission of the project was. And I picked out one paragraph, well, actually it's one sentence from the project application that I had pinned on my desk at work. And I should know this by heart, but I'm just going to read it out. And it is: the legacy of the project will be to increase biodiversity, knowledge, skills and confidence within a strong network of local community groups needed to deliver long-term development and care of wildlife and green spaces in partnership with local authorities. I think that sentence needed a few commas. So really what I wanted to ask is, did we achieve this? Some more pictures here. Did we achieve the aim? Well, we worked with a lot of groups. Some grew, a lot flourished, some hibernated, a few disappeared, and we had some new ones sprouting up as well. And I think this is a natural, really, because it's the way of community action. It's very organic. And what's important is the overall network, the strength of the network. And most groups, community groups, are small. And in some ways this could be considered a vulnerability of them, but it's also their strength, because they can respond quickly. You get new groups, new people, new ideas, and all these groups, what is a strength for them is that they are independent voices of the community, and we really needed to respect that through the project. Very much so. And so one of the things that we did very much was, a part of the project was about learning. And although we did have our training workshops throughout the 5 years, and these were very popular, some people absolutely loved them, booked on each one, and for other groups it just wasn't their thing. That's not a problem, because the way that we adjust our upskilling and learning was learning by doing. And I think for most of us that's how we learn, really. It's how I learned. I think how I learned my community work, going right back, was really when I think about it, as a volunteer starting the Oxford Urban Wildlife Group, and it was making every mistake there was possible, which was a very valuable, not at the time, it was quite stressful. What we did is, you can see in these projects that we had capital works, we had habitat improvements, we had sculptures, display boards, mosaics, and our community groups were involved in all the decision making, in the planning, often with getting the money in. Drinkfield, Bluebell Beck, here is Roseworth, all of them were money match funded from Tesco's, of which the groups played a big part in getting that in. And also the groups have worked really well at engaging with the community and hosting some really fun events with us. But all the groups are different. Very different experience, the community's different, the sites are different, different needs of our student placement, so it's adapting to that. But projects do finish, and one of the things we wanted to do was to build the network, and to do that it was about people in the project building links with others. And our groups, they're small, they're independent, but they are absolutely fabulous at sharing their skills, knowledge and expertise. And the workshops were a good opportunity to do this. This is why we had lots of coffee and cake breaks to allow people to build up relationships with each other. The conferences we did with Eric, and particularly the forums, the Middlesbrough Forum, the Doves in Darlington, and I think here there's some very strong lasting relationships. So to sum up on that part, what I think was important about the project was perhaps not what we did in the project, but how we did it. It's all about the process. So coming to the end of the project, and as you come to the end of the project, you start looking at the money you've got left. At the Wildlife Trust, we're always very careful with money. We're a small charity, and our estimates were pretty good. A 5-year project, we were 5% underspent, and the lottery, we got in touch with them, and they were really helpful and said, yes, we could use that money for this. And then this next slide is a little preview that no one has seen before, and this is our toolbox that we created at the end of the project. And this is not going to be online. Well, there might be an online version, but the feedback was that people wanted something in their hands that they could hold and look at. And this is no ordinary toolbox, because all through it are quotes from people who I've worked with in this project, and all their photographs of tips. And it's a bit like having them as your friend helping you start your group and do stuff. Now, this was meant to be published at lockdown. Obviously, we couldn't do that. But what it did mean, however, as I was in lockdown, is that a 32 pages, or was it 28 envisaged, is now 89. Haha. Right. So this is the contents of it. And we've got lots of stuff about caring for wildlife, but also the group mechanics. And this is all about the little details, that how to start a group, the insurance, your risk assessment, your health and safety, working with others, getting volunteers. There's such a lot out there, and reaching out, organising community events, tackling vandalism, harnessing social media. So lots and lots of stuff there. So we're really looking forward to that, hopefully with a celebration. And I put that in because it was just, I just thought it was a really pretty slide to show really simple activity. This is, you can see, from the hands being done by adults, not children. And it was one of the things that our group said at the end, is that they did feel confident to do loads like community events on their own, but they didn't have the materials. So what we've done is we've created a virtual, not virtual, it's real life, a library of tools and resources, and this includes things like pond dipping nets, gazebo, badge making machine. At the moment, it's all spread across the floor in room 27 at our Wildlife Trust headquarters, but we're really looking forward to opening that as a resource. So to finish up, what's next? Project's finished. I'm still here at the Wildlife Trust, and what everyone has been saying through this conference is that people have really recognised the importance of wild green space, but it's got to be really local to them. So I've been looking at projects on a micro level for people who are really struggling to get out and about, looking at projects to really investigate how we can use nature to address some of the well-being issues. So I think, as I've only got 20 seconds left on my clock, I'd better stop there and hand back over to Rachel. There you go.
Fantastic, Sue. Well, you can't fault your enthusiasm. That was great. Yeah, we had some.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sue. Gosh, yeah, really filled us with lots of enthusiasm. Had lots of lovely questions come through. So that's great. We're over to the question and answer section now, and I'll do my best to get a sort of like a bit of a spread and a bit of a selection. But as I said before, we're going to take all the questions and we will answer them all. If not live now, we'll put them on the website. And then one of the questions was about, is this information going to be available? The whole conference is being recorded and is going to be published through the conference website. So you'll be able to watch us again and again. Yes, so you will be able to see the PowerPoint presentation. Great. Okay, so I'm just going to pick out a few questions here, and in no particular order. So there was quite a few conversations around carbon and carbon sequestration and the flooding and all that kind of thing. So I will do a little plug here before I ask Eddie specifically. Is that we're aware this is a whole growing area, of course, and the climate challenge is upon us, and biodiversity is a big element of it. Eddie talked about the natural capital element of it and all the opportunities. And so the second half of our conference is going to be later on in the year, and it is going to have a climate focus, a nature and climate focus. So we'll be publishing that and inviting you all back along to specifically look at that issue. But we will touch on it now. So I'm just going to read out the question. And that was, so I know, Eddie, you've actually got a slide tucked up your sleeve that shows what the estuary could look like if there weren't any flood defences. So could you share that with us now?
Can you see that?
Wow, yes.
Yeah, so I guess a bit of context, because this is clearly a local nature conference today, but flood risk and tidal flood risk, certainly the eastern end of the area, is very important. So this is an image worked up by some of our engineers that shows the extent of a current high tide. So that's today's current high tide without any defences. So it just gives an impression about, I guess, how much the area relates to the sea. I guess how dependent it is on sea defences. I guess the economic impact of potential climate change. So this situation could get worse, but also the environmental impact as well. So I guess the eye is immediately arrested by the number of industries kind of are now islands within that water. But for those who know the area, we're kind of hovering over Saltholm and looking east out towards the mouth of the estuary. A number of different types of habitat that Mike flashed up before that will or could change as the climate changes. And how do we protect those? How do we manage those? How do we help the species that we're all so excited about in the Tees estuary as climate does change?
Excellent. Actually, I've just had a recent question here. I don't know if you can answer it, Eddie, or something we need to go away. And this is about how much more space, natural space, do we need in Teesside to sequester the carbon, to get to net zero carbon in our area?
I think we will have an answer to that shortly, won't we, Rachel? Because I think Tom was being interviewed by Tim earlier today, wasn't he, about the natural capital work he's doing. I know he's getting nearly there, and it will be launched later in the year. But I understand that's going to give us some really interesting figures about the space. And I think that the challenge is that we can't, I guess, sequester our way out of our carbon footprint. I think that's the important thing to take away, is it's going to be a really important and a big opportunity, and it will really help us. But we also will need to change our behaviours, won't we? Vastly reduce the amount of carbon we generate in the first place through the way we move about, the way we heat and power our activities.
Thank you, Eddie. Yes, and as I said, we'll be picking this up later on in the year, but there is some really great information out there. The Centre for Alternative Technologies have just opened a zero carbon hub, which I'd really recommend if you want to go and read some more information about this. How do we get this balance? It's a many-pronged approach to addressing it. But I'm going to pick up now on some of the health and well-being questions. Right, so one of them was, it's the balance between access and protection of nature. How do we balance that between the two? Is that an open enough question? Is that something that you'd like to answer, Mike? How do we get the balance between access and nature conservation? Can you unmute?
In most circumstances, actually, this can be accomplished very well. I mean, if you look at, say, I don't know, the Norfolk coast, which is quite a busy area for tourism and visitors, effectively, it's one long 30 or 40 mile strip of nature reserves with people both moving along the coast path, bird watching, but also doing other recreation along there. And it seems to work all right. I think the way that Saltholme, RSPB at Saltholme have managed their site shows that you can, get people out to view nature, to experience nature in a real close quarters, and yet still manage to protect that nature from disturbance. Obviously, for some species, some species are much more sensitive to disturbance than others. And for example, waders that breed on salt marshes probably do need a lot of space. But in most instances, it's perfectly possible, and nature is quite resilient to actually combine the two. I think that it's just some of the damaging activities like fires, barbecues, those sorts of things have a terrible impact, unplanned fires, but that they're behavioural issues rather than to do with actually having people there in the first place. Okay.
Thank you, Mike. That's great. Yes, and somebody said here there's likely to be a huge demand for mental health services as the COVID carries on. And that kind of links to another question about schools and having to social distance and using outdoor space. So I'm going to put those to Sue, those two questions. So that's about the mental health aspect and how nature can provide for that, and that's schools, and can schools utilise their outdoor spaces more?
Right, thank you, Rachel. So the first question is about mental health, and going right back to Steph's talk, all the evidence is out there, and we know it intrinsically how important the outdoor space is for mental health. But I think also looking back at Matt's work, it's not just being in space. There's also a great thing is people being able to participate and actually being part of the community and doing something, and that's really shown for some of the volunteers I meet in the Green Spaces groups. They are doing an awful lot of work, really hard work, but the benefits, what they say the benefits are to them is just being part of the community, being part of something, having a purpose. So it's linking them two things. And having pride and a shared ownership. So I think for nature conservation, we do know that funding is going to be very much limited, and I think that we should be, all of us, very much banging the drum on about how important that the nature isn't just this frilly bit on the outside, it is core and essential, and I think that case is getting stronger and stronger. But the other question is a lot harder, and using outdoor space, because it's all very well. There's some things you can teach outdoor space and others not. But I've been doing some work with Rosebrook primary school in Roseworth, and I think they are such a fantastic example because they have built up a forest school site, and it's been a lot of work for them. And what they've found, because it was a couple of teachers who started it off, is that the feedback they got from the other teachers was that they didn't just learn them outdoor skills, but it made a real difference to the whole school, to teachers, to pupils, and children really do work well doing very different activities outdoors. And it is incredible seeing that growth in the forest schools network across the Tees Valley, and I think that's just going to grow more and more.
So just to add to that, a couple of topical questions here about reaching out to people who don't traditionally get involved, be that the sort of volunteer profile. There's one about ethnic diversity. So you had lots of great pictures, but there didn't appear to be a huge diversity with that project. So.
Yes, and the groups I worked with, the 20 groups I worked with, were established friends groups, and I've been very much interested to see some of in more urban areas. I think there's quite a lot of scope for project driven, where a community might do something, but it's not a continuous project. And I think some of the work that Barefoot Kitchens are doing and others in the very urban green spaces, I think there's a lot of scope for community garden projects and growing food, and I think that's a really good way to reach more people in the actual food growing projects. And as Catherine's video showed for anyone who was in that workshop, is that there's great scope for wildlife there as well.
That's great, yes, and thanks for that prompt, because I know MEMA have got a very active group and diverse group that garden, the garden outside MEMA, and in fact that links to a big Arts Council award to our area that covers the South Tees, of a sort of multi-million-pound award for a new arts project that called Borderlands, and they've selected the environment as their theme. So, which is really exciting. So it's getting really deeply in there with those communities in the South Tees, and looking at the environment, but through the eyes of arts and culture. So watch this space, because we'll be saying more about that later, but that kind of does go some way towards addressing it. But being a bit creative with how you engage people, I think, is part of the answer to that. Right, I'm quite conscious of time. There's some great questions. You're welcome as well after this to email us questions to tvmp@teeswildlife.org, and because we'd like to stay in touch. It's really important that we hear from everybody and that we reach out and connect to people, and get your voice, and so that we can use the voice of people across the Tees Valley to channel in to the strategic work that we're doing to influence all those big decisions and big strategic decisions that have an impact on our lives. So please do keep connected and keep sending those questions through. But for now, I'm going to say thank you very much to our panel. Thank you to Mike from INCA. Thank you to Eddie from the Environment Agency. And thank you very much, Sue from the Tees Valley Wildlife Trust. And I'm going to hand back to you now.